If you can play that piano like a professional, I'll marry you to my son. The words sliced through the glittering chandelier light of New York's Whitmore Grand Hotel, where tuxedos and gowns swirled in a sea of champagne flutes. A young black janitor, her hands calloused from years of mopping floors, stood frozen as laughter erupted. She endured daily slights, being called you instead of her name, told to stay out of the frame, and ordered to use the service elevator to remain unseen. Yet beneath her uniform lay a buried talent, one that could shift the room's center of gravity. What unfolds will challenge power, expose hidden biases, and redefine dignity. Will her music rewrite the night? Subscribe to our channel for the latest stories and share where you're watching from. Stay tuned. Can one performance change everything? The Grand Hall of the Whitmore Grand Hotel shimmered under cascades of crystal chandelier light, a constellation of wealth and elegance in the heart of New York. Tuxedos and evening gowns glided across marble floors, their movements choreographed to the soft clink of champagne flutes. Laughter rose and fell, polished as the silver trays carried by unseen hands. In a dim service corridor, Farida Yusuf, a 28-year-old black janitor with long, tightly coiled hair, pulled into a neat bun, pushed her cleaning cart with the precision of 5 years' practice. Her dark eyes, sharp and quiet, traced the opulence from the sidelines, catching glints of diamonds and the practiced smiles of the elite. She was part of the machinery that kept the gala flawless, yet her presence was meant to dissolve into the background, unnoticed. Farida moved with deliberate care, her hands steady as she folded rags into perfect squares, aligning them on her cart. A PR staffer, clipboard in hand, swept past, her voice clipped and professional. "Stay out of the frame, please," she said, not meeting Farida's gaze. "We need to keep the event's image clean." The words were polite, routine, but they landed like a soft blade, slicing Farida's existence into the margins. Her name tag, pinned neatly to her navy uniform, gleamed with the word Farida, but the staffer's eyes slid past it, addressing her as you, with a smile that was neither cruel nor kind, just distant. Farida nodded, her face a mask of calm, and steered her cart toward the service elevator, her footsteps silent against the polished floor. As she worked, a memory flickered, unbidden. Years ago, her fingers had danced across ivory keys in a city theater, the audience rising to applaud a young prodigy. She had been a standout at the conservatory, her performances vibrant with a soulful depth that drew whispers of awe. But that world had crumbled when her mother fell ill, hospital bills piling like a storm. Farida had sold her first piano, a hard-earned treasure from scholarships and side jobs, to cover the costs. Later, at an audition, a director's voice had cut deeper than any debt. "Play less soulful. It doesn't fit the venue." The critique, delivered with a tight smile, had pushed her toward the exit, her dreams locked behind a door she no longer had the key to open. Back in the present, Farida paused near the edge of the main hall, collecting empty glasses from a table. A guest in a sequined gown, phone poised for a photo, waved her away. "You should know your place," she said, her tone light, almost helpful, as if advising a child. The words stung, not for their venom, but for their casual assumption that Farida belonged outside the circle of light. She murmured an apology, her voice low, and stepped back, her cart creaking faintly. The guest's eyes didn't linger. They returned to the camera, capturing a moment that erased Farida. Near the far end of the hall stood a Steinway Model D, its polished black surface catching the chandelier's glow like a mirror of stars. Farida's gaze drifted to it, her fingers twitching as if remembering the cool touch of ivory. For a moment, she could almost feel the keys beneath her hands, the music waiting to spill out. But a manager's voice broke the spell. "Use the service elevator, Farida," he said, his tone friendly but firm, the word Farida an afterthought, as if reading it off her badge for the first time. She turned away from the piano, her shoulders squaring as she pushed her cart toward the corridor, the weight of invisibility settling heavier. The gala pulsed on, a symphony of wealth and charity. Guests mingled, their conversations a blend of generosity and self-interest, while Farida circled the edges, collecting glasses, wiping table rims, her movements calculated to avoid notice. A security guard trailed her at a distance, his gaze not hostile but trained, as if her presence required monitoring. She showed her staff ID with a polite smile, and he nodded, moving on. Yet when she stepped too close to a photo setup, a guest beckoned sharply. "Hey, you, move aside," he said, pointing to the carpet's edge. Farida complied, her face impassive, but the words echoed, another reminder to stay out of the frame. As she neared the Steinway again, Farida's cart brushed a table, and a tray of glasses teetered. She reached to steady it, but one slipped, shattering on the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot. The room's attention swiveled, heads turning, phones lifting. Farida knelt to gather the shards, her hands steady despite the eyes boring into her. From the grand doors, Victoria Whitmore emerged, her red silk gown catching the light like a flame. The billionaire hostess, her diamonds glittering, strode forward, her smile sharp as glass. The air tightened as she stopped before Farida, the crowd's murmurs fading into anticipation. "If you can play that piano like a professional, I'll marry you to my son," Victoria said, her voice clear and cold, slicing through the hall. Laughter erupted, a wave of amusement tinged with cruelty, as guests exchanged glances, some raising glasses in mock toasts. The words were a dare, a public jest meant to underscore the gap between the janitor and the elite. Farida stood, the broken glass still in her gloved hands, her heart pounding but her gaze steady. The room waited, expecting her to shrink back into the shadows, to let the moment pass as a fleeting spectacle. But Farida set the glass on her cart, her movements deliberate. She straightened, her eyes locking onto Victoria's. The chandelier light caught the edge of her name tag, making it gleam. "My name is Farida," she said, her voice ringing with quiet steel. "Not you, not girl." The hall fell silent, the laughter choking off as if caught in a sudden frost. Every eye fixed on her, the weight of their stares shifting from mockery to something else. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the faint stir of recognition. Farida stood tall, her presence no longer invisible, a single note of defiance poised to rewrite the night. The silence in the Whitmore Grand Hotel's Grand Hall hung heavy, a taut wire stretched across the sea of glittering gowns and tuxedos. Farida Yusuf stood at its center, her words, "My name is Farida, not you, not girl," still echoing, a defiant note that had quieted the mocking laughter. The chandelier light bathed the Steinway Model D behind her, its polished surface gleaming like a challenge. The crowd's eyes, once dismissive, now flickered with curiosity, some with unease as they waited for her next move. Victoria Whitmore, the billionaire hostess in her flame-red gown, stood with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her dare, "If you can play that piano like a professional, I'll marry you to my son," lingering like a gauntlet thrown. Farida's gaze held steady, unyielding, as she turned toward the piano, the room's pulse shifting with her. With deliberate grace, Farida stepped toward the Steinway, her navy uniform stark against the opulent backdrop. She paused, her hands hovering over the gloves that encased them, stained from hours of cleaning. Slowly, she peeled off the rubber gloves, each movement a quiet shedding of the invisible cloak she'd worn for years. The crowd murmured, phones rising like a forest of tiny lights, ready to capture what they assumed would be a spectacle. A man in a tailored suit whispered to his companion, "She's going through with it?" The woman beside him smirked, adjusting her diamond bracelet. "Let's see how long this lasts." Their voices carried the weight of expectation, presuming failure before a single note was played. Farida sat at the bench, her posture composed, her fingers brushing the ivory keys with a reverence that silenced her doubts. The room's chatter faded as she pressed the first note of "Summertime," a soft, deliberate sound that seemed to exhale into the hall. The melody unfolded slowly, its tempo measured, each phrase evoking humid evenings on a front porch, the air thick with the hum of cicadas and distant laughter. Her left hand lay down a gentle rhythm, steady as footsteps on a summer sidewalk, while her right hand wove a line of notes, each one falling with the weight of memory. The music wasn't loud or showy. It was a conversation, intimate and unguarded, pulling the listener into a world far from the gala's polished veneer. The laughter that had erupted at Victoria's dare began to falter. A woman in a sapphire gown lowered her phone, her brow furrowing as the melody reached her. "I didn't think she could allay," she whispered to her date, her voice tinged with surprise. He shrugged, his eyes narrowing. "Probably just a fluke." But as Farida moved into the song's crescendo, her fingers dancing with a precision that belied her janitor's uniform, the room's energy shifted. Phones dipped, their screens dimming as guests leaned forward, drawn into the music's quiet power. The notes seemed to carve a space where Farida was no longer a shadow but a presence, her talent a rebuke to their assumptions. At the hall's edge, James Harper, a white-haired music critic with a reputation for unsparing judgment, stood with a notebook in hand. His silver pen paused as he watched Farida's hands, his head tilting slightly. "Authentic emotion, no theatrics," he scribbled, his lips pursing in approval. He noted the way she used the pedal sparingly, letting each note breathe before fading, a choice that spoke of discipline honed in solitude. Her playing wasn't a performance for applause. It was a declaration, a reclaiming of a voice long silenced. A nearby guest, his cufflinks glinting, muttered, "She's not bad," his tone grudging, as if reluctant to concede her skill. Harper's eyes flicked toward him, but returned to Farida, his pen moving again. As the final notes of "Summertime" lingered, Farida kept her gaze on the keys, letting the silence settle like dust after a storm. She didn't turn to the crowd, didn't seek their approval. The room exhaled, and a scattering of claps broke out, tentative at first, then growing. A man in a velvet blazer tried to reclaim the moment's levity. "Just luck, right?" he called, his laugh forced, but it died in the air, drowned by the applause that swelled, uneven but undeniable. Farida's hands rested lightly on the keys, her shoulders relaxed, as if the music had carried away the weight of the room's judgment. But the moment was cut short. The chandeliers flickered, then plunged into darkness as the power shut off, a sharp click echoing through the hall. Murmurs rose, a mix of confusion and irritation. A PR staffer's voice cut through, smooth and commanding. "Enough, back to the program." The words were a signal, a calculated move to restore order, to push Farida back into the shadows. Guests shuffled, some chuckling nervously, others whispering, "What was that about?" The blackout wasn't an accident. It was a reflex, a subtle denial of Farida's talent, as if her presence on the stage threatened the gala's carefully curated image. Another staffer, her heels clicking, approached the piano. "Get off the stage," she said, her tone polite but firm, her eyes avoiding Farida's name tag. Farida stood, her movements unhurried, her face betraying no anger. She folded her gloves neatly, placing them on her cart, which waited like a loyal companion in the wings. The crowd's attention began to drift, phones lighting up again as guests resumed their conversations, ready to let the moment dissolve. Victoria Whitmore, standing near the grand doors, adjusted her gown, her smile returning as if the interruption had never happened. But Farida didn't retreat. She stepped away from the Steinway, her footsteps measured, and moved toward the service corridor, her silhouette fading into the dim light. In the darkened hallway, where the walls were scuffed and the air smelled of cleaning fluid, Farida paused. Her eyes caught the outline of an old upright piano, tucked against a corner, its wood chipped, but its keys intact. She approached it, her fingers brushing the dusty surface, and sat down. The first note of a new jazz melody rang out, sharp and clear, echoing through the service corridor and up the emergency stairs. The sound was defiant, a refusal to be silenced, carrying a rhythm that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of every worker who'd ever been told to stay out of the frame. As the notes spilled into the night, they beckoned, a siren call that would soon draw the gala's glittering crowd into a space they'd never deigned to enter. The first note of Farida Yusuf's jazz melody pierced the dim service corridor of the Whitmore Grand Hotel, a defiant pulse that refused to be silenced by the gala's abrupt blackout. Her fingers moved across the chipped keys of the old upright piano, sending a rhythm that echoed up the emergency stairs, a siren call cutting through the scuffed walls and the faint scent of cleaning fluid. The sound carried the heartbeat of every worker told to stay out of the frame, a melody that beckoned beyond the shadows, pulling the glittering crowd from the grand hall into a space they'd never thought to enter. The corridor, narrow and lit by flickering fluorescence, was a world apart from the chandelier-lit splendor above. Bare concrete floors bore the marks of countless carts, and peeling paint revealed years of neglect. Farida sat at the upright, its wood worn but sturdy, her navy uniform blending into the dimness. Her music, a vibrant jazz improvisation, wove a tapestry of syncopated rhythms, each note sharp and deliberate, like a voice demanding to be heard. Guests in tuxedos and gowns, drawn by the sound, hesitated at the corridor's entrance, their polished shoes scuffing against the threshold. A woman in an emerald dress clutched her purse, her voice low but sharp. "Why are we down here? This isn't our place." Her words, meant as a complaint, carried an unwitting echo of the gala's unspoken rules, marking the spaces beneath them. The crowd pressed in, their silk and satin incongruous against the utilitarian backdrop. A man in a pinstripe suit frowned, adjusting his cufflinks. "This is absurd," he muttered, yet he didn't turn away, his eyes fixed on Farida's hands as they danced across the keys. The music shifted, taking on the complex swinging cadence of Take 5, its 5/4 time signature, a challenge that Farida met with effortless precision. Her left hand anchored the rhythm, steady as a pulse, while her right hand spun a melody that twisted and soared, evoking a city night alive with possibility. The notes seemed to erase the corridor's drabness, transforming it into a stage where Farida was no longer invisible. At the edge of the gathering, Gloria Johnson, a veteran housekeeper with gray-streaked hair, stood with a quiet dignity. Her eyes, lined with years of unseen labor, watched Farida with a mix of pride and resolve. She stepped forward, her voice carrying over the music, steady and unadorned. "She was a star at the conservatory," Gloria said, her words cutting through the crowd's murmurs. "Top of her class, played at the City Theater when she was just 22. But when her mother got sick, the bills came like a flood. She sold her piano to keep the hospital at bay." The crowd stilled, some shifting uncomfortably, their champagne flutes forgotten. Gloria's voice grew firmer. "They told her at an audition to play less soulful, said she didn't fit the image of their hall. That's why she's here, cleaning floors instead of playing them." A woman in the front, her pearl necklace catching the dim light, brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes widening. "I saw her perform back then," she said, her voice soft but clear. "They called her a rising star." Her name was Eleanor, a retired school teacher who'd once frequented the city's music halls. She turned to the man beside her, who nodded slowly. "I remember the reviews," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "She was exceptional." The words hung in the air, a quiet indictment of the barriers that had pushed Farida to the margins. The music swelled, Farida's fingers navigating a tricky passage with a grace that silenced doubt. Her melody a bridge between her past and the present moment. James Harper, the white-haired music critic, leaned against a wall, his notebook open, his pen moving swiftly. "Flawless control, bold phrasing," he wrote, his eyes narrowing as he tracked Farida's technique. He noted the way she leaned into the offbeats, giving the piece a freshness that made the familiar feel new. "She's better than the hired artist," a young guest whispered nearby, his phone idle in his hand, no longer recording but listening. The crowd, packed into the narrow corridor, stood transfixed, their earlier amusement replaced by a dawning respect. The music seemed to pull them closer, dissolving the distance between their world and hers. But not all were swayed. A man in a velvet jacket muttered to his companion, "This doesn't belong here," his tone low but laced with unease, as if Farida's talent threatened the gala's carefully curated hierarchy. His words, though quiet, echoed the same sentiment that had kept Farida in the service corridors, a subtle reminder that her presence was an intrusion to some. Yet the music pressed on, undeterred, its rhythm weaving through the crowd like a current, pulling even the skeptical into its flow. A server, her tray balanced precariously, paused to listen, her eyes shining with something like recognition, as if the notes spoke for her too. As Farida brought Take 5 to a close, the final note lingered, sharp and clear, before fading into the corridor's stillness. The crowd exhaled, a collective breath, and applause broke out, louder than in the grand hall, carrying a weight of acknowledgement. Farida didn't look up. her hands resting lightly on the keys, her face calm but resolute. The lights in the main hall flickered back on, their glow spilling faintly into the corridor, signaling the gala's attempt to reclaim control. Victoria Whitmore's voice echoed from above, smooth and commanding. Impressive talent, but let's move on. The words were a dismissal, a bid to restore the evening's script. But the crowd didn't move. A woman in a silver gown called out, "Keep your word!" Her voice was joined by others, a chorus of insistence that rippled through the corridor. Farida stood, her uniform stark against the upright's worn frame, and turned toward the main hall. Her steps were steady, her eyes fixed on the path ahead, where the Steinway waited under the chandeliers. The music she'd played had cracked open a door, and the crowd's demand for accountability was pushing it wider, drawing her back to the stage where the night's true reckoning would unfold. The music Farida Yusuf played in the service corridor had cracked open a door, and the crowd's insistent chant, "Keep your word," was pushing it wider, drawing her back to the Grand Hall where the Steinway Model D stood under the Whitmore Grand Hotel's chandeliers. The marble floor gleamed, reflecting the glittering light as Farida stepped onto the stage, her navy uniform a stark contrast to the sea of silk and sequins. Phones rose like a tide, their screens glowing with "Vriyi Farida Yusuf" and "Keep Your Word," capturing every moment of a night that was slipping from its scripted course. Victoria Whitmore, the billionaire hostess, stood rigid in her red gown, her smile a thin veneer, as the crowd's demand for accountability swelled, a wave threatening to upend her carefully curated gala. Farida positioned herself before the Steinway, her posture unyielding, her eyes locking onto Victoria's. The air was thick with expectation, the crowd's earlier amusement now a distant memory. "I need you to keep your word," Farida said, her voice clear and measured, cutting through the hum of whispers. "Not just to me, but to everyone called the wrong name, pushed to the edges." The hall erupted, a chorus of voices echoing, "Keep your word." The chant pulsed like a heartbeat, each syllable a challenge to Victoria's authority. A man in a tailored tuxedo raised his glass, his voice sharp. "You made a promise." The words struck like a gavel, amplifying the weight of Victoria's earlier dare. James Harper, the white-haired music critic, stood near the stage, his notebook closed, his gaze steady. "This is professional-level performance," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of years spent judging talent. His words landed like a seal, validating Farida's skill in a room that had doubted her. The crowd's energy shifted, some nodding, others exchanging glances, as if grappling with the reality that a janitor had outshone their expectations. Phones buzzed, screens flashing with notifications as a viral video spread. Victoria's mocking, "If you can play that piano like a professional, I'll marry you to my son," spliced against Farida's soulful "Summertime," captioned, "Heiress mocks black janitor, then she plays like a genius." The hashtag Dashish Ya Farida Yusuf trended, a digital storm gathering momentum. Victoria adjusted her diamond bracelet, her smile tightening as she stepped toward the microphone. "We appreciate the talent," she said, her tone smooth but evasive. "But let's move forward with the program." The words were a calculated sidestep, a bid to reclaim control, but they rang hollow. A woman in a silver gown called out, "You made a promise." Her voice was joined by others, a rising tide of insistence that drowned Victoria's attempt to redirect the night. The PR team stationed near the grand doors exchanged frantic glances. A staffer leaned in, whispering urgently, "We're losing control of the narrative." Victoria's phone vibrated in her clutch, a cascade of messages from shareholders. "Don't let a personal matter become a corporate commitment." The legal team texted, "No confirmation of any marriage promise," their words a shield against liability. But the crowd wasn't interested in corporate spin. A young guest, his tie loosened, scrolled through his phone, reading aloud a comment under one Shunk PR stunt. "She's just a janitor. Don't overhype it." The remark, sharp and dismissive, echoed the subtle bias that had kept Farida in the shadows, presuming her talent was an anomaly, not a truth. Yet the room's energy was shifting, the applause from the corridor still resonating in their minds. Farida, undeterred, sat at the Steinway, her fingers brushing the keys with a quiet resolve. She began to play Second Shift, a composition born from the rhythm of night shift footsteps and the hum of a floor buffer. The melody was raw and communal, its notes weaving a story of labor and resilience, each phrase a testament to those who worked unseen. The music swelled, its tempo steady but powerful, like a march that refused to be ignored. Farida's left hand laid down a pulsing bass line, it evoking the cadence of late-night corridors, while her right hand traced a soaring melody, bright and unyielding. The crowd stood transfixed, some rising to their feet, their eyes glistening with tears. A woman in a velvet dress clutched her partner's arm, whispering, "This is more than music." The notes seemed to reach beyond the hall, speaking to every worker who'd ever been told to stay out of the frame. A server at the edge of the room, her tray forgotten, wiped her eyes, the music a mirror to her unseen labor. James Harper opened his notebook again, jotting, "A composition that speaks truth." He noted the way Farida's dynamics shifted, never overpowering but always commanding, a balance that turned the piano into a voice for the marginalized. The crowd's applause grew, no longer tentative but full-throated, a recognition that shook the chandeliers. A man who'd earlier scoffed now stood, his hands clapping slowly, as if reconciling with his misjudgment. But not all were moved. A guest in a pinstripe suit muttered, "This is getting out of hand," his tone laced with unease, as if Farida's music threatened the gala's hierarchy. The comment, though quiet, carried the weight of a system that preferred her silence. Victoria's phone buzzed again, a shareholder's message flashing. "Contain this now." The PR staffer approached, her voice low. "We need to pivot, or this goes viral in the worst way." Victoria's jaw tightened, her mind racing through risk charts, shareholder backlash, media scrutiny, corporate reputation. She raised her hand, signaling for quiet, her voice cutting through the applause. "This has been an unexpected moment," she said, her smile practiced but strained. "Let's return to the schedule." But the crowd's chant, "Keep your word," returned, louder, unrelenting. Farida rose from the bench, her gaze steady, her presence a quiet demand for accountability. The room's tension was palpable, a tightrope stretched between Victoria's authority and Farida's truth. Victoria's eyes flicked to the PR team, then back to Farida. "We need to resolve this," she said, her voice low, almost a plea, though her posture remained rigid. The words were an invitation, but also a retreat, a signal that the stage was no longer hers to control. Farida nodded, her expression unwavering, her eyes conveying a readiness to set terms. "I'll meet you," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But this isn't over." The crowd murmured, some cheering, others filming, as Farida stepped off the stage, her footsteps deliberate, her resolve unshaken, prepared to confront Victoria in a space where words would carry weight. Farida Yusuf stepped off the stage, her footsteps deliberate, her resolve unshaken, prepared to confront Victoria Whitmore in a space where words would carry weight. The grand hall's clamor faded as the heavy oak door of the second-floor manager's office clicked shut behind them, muffling the crowd's chants of, "Keep your word." The room was a stark contrast to the chandelier-lit splendor below. Plain beige walls, a polished desk, and a single window framing New York's glittering skyline. Victoria leaned against the desk, her red gown catching the dim light, her fingers brushing the dried champagne stain from earlier that night. Farida stood a measured distance away, her navy uniform crisp, her hands loosely clasped, her gaze steady as a metronome. The air was thick with the unspoken, a tightrope stretched between power and truth. Farida broke the silence first, her voice calm but unyielding. "I don't want a marriage," she said, each word deliberate. "I want you to keep your word the right way, to me and the culture here." Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, her head tilting as if weighing a contract. Farida continued, her tone even, like a musician setting the tempo. "A public apology using my name, Farida Yusuf. A scholarship fund, call it the Farida Yusuf Scholarship Fund, for underprivileged musicians. A series of community concerts, keys for dignity, to bring music where it's rare. And policy changes to end the invisible staff rules, bias training, calling staff by name, opening service elevators, listening to frontline workers." Victoria's fingers paused on the champagne stain, her brow furrowing. Can keep your word be quantified? She asked, her voice dry, honed by years of measuring everything in metrics. KPI, ROI, sentiment. Farida didn't flinch. Yes, she replied, her eyes locked on Victoria's. A clear apology with my name. No hedging. 2 commitments, the scholarship and the concerts. 3 policy changes, call staff by their names, open the service elevators for non-security use, and hold listening sessions with workers like me. That's how you quantify dignity. Her words were a blueprint, precise and unadorned, yet they carried the weight of years spent unseen. Victoria's phone buzzed on the desk, a relentless pulse of incoming messages. She glanced at it, the screen lighting up with texts from the legal team. Avoid marriage commitment at all costs. A shareholder's message followed. Don't let this spiral into a corporate liability. Her jaw tightened, her mind racing through the familiar calculus of risk, reputation, stock prices, media fallout. She'd built her empire by sidestepping traps, but Farida's demands weren't a trap. They were a mirror, reflecting a system she'd never questioned. A memory flickered. Farida's earlier rebuke, "My name is Farida," and the countless times Victoria had passed staff without seeing their name tags, issuing orders like, "Stay out of the frame." The phrase, a routine directive, now felt like a confession of complicity in a culture that erased identities. Why should I agree? Victoria asked, her tone testing, though a crack of uncertainty crept in. This could be spun as a PR win without all this. Farida's gaze didn't waver. Because dodging it will cost you more, she said. The crowd out there, the phones, the hashtags, they're not going away. You can't spin your way out of a promise made in front of 1,000 witnesses. She paused, her voice softening but firm. I'll help you build a culture of respect, not on a stage for applause, but in the hallways, in emails, in meeting agendas. That's my offer. The proposal was a bridge, not a demand, extending a path forward but holding Victoria accountable. Victoria's fingers tightened around her phone, the screen flashing with another message. No binding statements. She set it face down, her mind caught between the safety of corporate strategy and the risk of public judgment. She thought of the viral video, her voice mocking, "If you can play that piano like a professional, I'll marry you to my son," now spreading like wildfire with gouache, Farida Yusuf, and keep your word. Evading Farida's terms would fuel the narrative of a billionaire shirking responsibility, a story that would haunt boardrooms and headlines. What if I don't meet every demand? She asked, her voice low, testing the boundaries. Then I'll remind you in front of everyone, Farida replied, her tone steady, not a threat but a fact. Not to shame you, but to hold you to what you said. The simplicity of her words cut through Victoria's calculations, exposing the fragility of power built on avoidance. Farida's mind drifted briefly to a moment years ago, when a conservatory director had dismissed her with a smile. Play less soulful, it doesn't fit. The memory stung, not for its cruelty, but for its assumption that her talent was an outlier, unfit for the polished stages. The Whitmore's stay out of the frame rule was the same assumption in a different guise, a system that kept her and others like her in the shadows. Victoria exhaled, her shoulders easing slightly, as if shedding a layer of armor. I'll do it, she said, her voice quiet but resolute. The apology, the scholarship, the concerts, the policy changes. But I need to say it my way. Farida nodded, her expression unchanged. Say it your way, but mean it. Use my name. Make it real. The agreement was a contract, not of paper, but of trust, binding them to a moment that could reshape the Whitmore's culture. Victoria's phone buzzed again, but she ignored it, her focus on Farida, whose presence filled the room more than any chandelier ever could. The door to the office cracked open, a sliver of the hall's noise seeping in. Murmurs, the clink of glasses, the faint echo of "Hanasha, keep your word" chants. A PR staffer poked her head in, her voice urgent. They're waiting. The cameras are live. Victoria straightened, smoothing her gown, her fingers lingering briefly on the champagne stain before letting go. Farida stepped toward the door, her uniform a quiet defiance, her eyes conveying a readiness to stand beside but not behind. They descended the stairs together, the roar of the grand hall growing louder, a tide of expectation waiting to crash. In the hall, the chandeliers blazed, their light reflecting off the marble like a mirror of the night's tension. Victoria gripped the microphone, her knuckles pale, as Farida stood to her side, not stealing the spotlight but anchoring it. The crowd's eyes locked on them, phones raised, the air thick with anticipation. Victoria took a deep breath, her voice poised to carry the weight of her next words. "I was wrong," she began, the phrase a spark that would either ignite change or burn out in the noise. Farida stood still, her gaze steady, ready to hold the promise to its truth. Victoria Whitmore took a deep breath, her voice poised to carry the weight of her next words. "I was wrong," a spark that could ignite change or flicker out in the noise of the Whitmore Grand Hotel's Grand Hall. The chandeliers cast a radiant glow across the marble floor, their light reflecting the tension in the packed room. Farida Yusuf stood to her side, her navy uniform a quiet anchor, her presence steady without stealing the spotlight. Cameras swiveled, their lenses trained on Victoria, while phones glowed with Cornishoni Farida Yusuf and Shwarshish Keep Your Word, capturing a moment that balanced on the edge of transformation. The crowd, a sea of tuxedos and gowns, leaned forward, their murmurs hushed, waiting for Victoria to face the promise she'd made. Victoria gripped the microphone, her knuckles pale against the silver, her red gown shimmering like a warning. "I was wrong to disrespect Farida Yusuf," she began, her voice clear, cutting through the hall's charged silence. "I called her the wrong name, made my employee invisible. I apologize unconditionally." The words landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading as the crowd exhaled. No hedging, no, if anyone was offended. Just a raw admission that hung in the air. A woman in a sapphire dress clutched her clutch, her eyes widening, while a man nearby nodded slowly, as if recalibrating his view of the night. She pressed on, her tone steady but weighted with resolve. "To make this right, I'm announcing the Farida Yusuf Scholarship Fund for underprivileged musicians. Applications open in 30 days, managed by an independent board." A murmur of approval rose, a few hands clapping softly. "We'll launch Keys for Dignity concerts in Harlem and Brooklyn, starting in 2 weeks with Farida opening, paid at union rates." The crowd's energy shifted, the applause growing. "We're ending the stay out of the frame policy," Victoria continued, her voice firm. "Service elevators will be open for non-security use, and staff will be called by their names starting tomorrow." A server at the hall's edge straightened, her name tag glinting as if newly seen. Victoria's gaze swept the room. "We'll raise the minimum wage to the city's living standard and add health stipends for night shifts, effective next quarter. Mandatory DEI training begins with me, with anonymous surveys and public reports to ensure accountability." She paused, her eyes meeting Farida's briefly. "And I'm inviting Farida Yusuf to serve as human values advisor to ensure staff voices are heard." The crowd erupted, applause thundering through the hall, not just for the promises but for their specificity, a blueprint for change etched in public view. James Harper, the white-haired music critic, stood near the stage, his voice cutting through the din. "This is accountability, not PR," he said, his words a stamp of authenticity that silenced skeptics. Not all were convinced. A guest in a velvet blazer whispered to his companion, "Is all this necessary for one performance?" His tone, low but sharp, betrayed discomfort, as if Victoria's concessions challenged the privilege of a world where staff remained unseen. The stay-out-of-the-frame rule, a quiet fixture of the Whitmore's culture, lingered in his words, a symbol of a system that preferred invisibility. Yet the applause drowned his murmur, the crowd's momentum carrying a new current. At the hall's edge, Gloria Johnson, the veteran housekeeper, stepped forward, her gray-streaked hair catching the light. "I'm Gloria," she said, her voice steady, "and this is James, Maria." She gestured to the staff beside her, their name tags suddenly focal points. The crowd, once distant, began to echo, calling out, "Maria!" and "James!" a tentative breaking of an invisible barrier. Farida moved to the Steinway, her fingers brushing the keys with a quiet reverence. She sat, her posture calm, and began to play Second Shift again, its melody a tapestry of night shift footsteps and the hum of unseen labor. The notes were bold yet intimate, each phrase a declaration that dignity needed no uniform. Her left hand wove a steady rhythm, like the pulse of a city that never slept, while her right hand traced a soaring line, bright with resilience. The crowd stood, some with tears in their eyes, the music a mirror to lives long overlooked. A woman in a pearl choker whispered, "This is what truth sounds like," her voice trembling as the melody reached her. James Harper opened his notebook, jotting, "A composition that redefines the room." He noted the way Farida's dynamics shifted, never overpowering but commanding, turning the piano into a voice for the marginalized. The applause swelled as she played, a standing ovation that shook the chandeliers. A man who'd earlier scoffed now clapped, his hands moving slowly, as if acknowledging a shift he couldn't ignore. Gloria's eyes glistened, her hands clasped tightly, as if the music carried the weight of every shift she'd worked in silence. The servers and cleaners at the hall's edges stood taller, their name tags no longer mere decorations, but badges of identity. Victoria stepped back from the microphone, her gown catching the light as she moved. The crowd's applause was a tide, not just for Farida, but for the promises now etched in public memory. She felt the weight of her phone, still buzzing with messages from shareholders and legal advisors. But their warnings felt distant. The room had changed, its hierarchy softened by names called aloud. Victoria turned to Gloria, her voice low but clear. "Thank you, Miss Gloria," she said, the name a deliberate choice, a first step towards seeing the unseen. Gloria nodded, her expression soft but firm, as if accepting the gesture as a beginning, not an end. The hall thundered with applause, the crowd rising to their feet, a collective acknowledgement that reverberated off the marble walls. Farida let the final note of Second Shift fade, her hands resting lightly on the keys, her gaze fixed on no one, letting the music speak its last. She stood, her presence a quiet force, as the crowd's ovation washed over her. Victoria stepped down from the platform, her heels clicking softly, and stood among the staff, her red gown no longer a barrier, but a bridge. The night had shifted, not just in words but in the promise of action, a turning point sealed by a melody that refused to be silenced. The night at the Whitmore Grand Hotel had shifted, sealed by a melody that refused to be silenced. As Victoria Whitmore stepped down from the platform, her red gown no longer a barrier, but a bridge to a new understanding. The Grand Hall chandeliers dimmed slightly, their glow softening as the gala drew to a close, giving way to the quiet hum of the night shift beginning. Farida Yusuf stood by the Steinway, her navy uniform a quiet testament to the courage that had reshaped the evening. The crowd's standing ovation lingered, a thunderous acknowledgement of a turning point as staff in blue and black uniforms moved into the hall, their name tags catching the fading light. The air held a new weight, one of promises made and a future poised to unfold. Farida walked past the night shift workers, her steps deliberate, her eyes meeting theirs. "James," she said, nodding to a cleaner with a tired smile. "Maria," she continued, addressing a server adjusting her apron. "Thomas," she called to a security guard, his badge glinting. Each name was a small hammer, chipping away at the invisibility that had long cloaked them. They responded with smiles, tentative at first, then brightening, as if seeing themselves reflected for the first time. Maria's eyes shone, her voice soft. "Nobody's ever called me by name on shift." The moment was quiet but profound, a ripple of recognition spreading through the workers, their name tags no longer mere formalities, but badges of presence. Victoria, her heels clicking softly, stepped into the service elevator, a space she'd never entered before. The doors closed with a dull thud, shutting out the grand hall's opulence. Inside, the air was stale, the walls scuffed, a stark contrast to the marble and crystal above. She stood beside a cleaner, his name tag reading Daniel. He glanced at her, surprised, and said, "First time I've seen the boss down here." Victoria nodded, her usual polish softened by the moment. "Tell me about your shift," she said, her voice genuine, not a directive, but an invitation. Daniel hesitated, then spoke of long hours, aching feet, and the rare chance to be heard. Victoria listened, her phone silent in her clutch, the weight of shareholder demands momentarily irrelevant. Outside, the digital storm raged on. Phones buzzed with "Keep Your Word" trending alongside "PR stunt." The internet split between those inspired and those skeptical. A post under "Stock PR stunt" sneered, "Is this necessary or just a show?" A jab that echoed the resistance of those clinging to the status quo, uncomfortable with a janitor's elevation. But other voices rose, sharing photos of the Farida Yusuf Scholarship Fund, announcement and Keys for Dignity concert plans. Their captions simple: "Call me by my name." A server posted a selfie, her name tag prominent, with the words, "Finally seen." The hashtags pulsed, a digital heartbeat carrying Farida's story beyond the hall, amplifying a call for dignity that refused to fade. James Harper, the white-haired music critic, stood near the stage, his pen moving across his notebook. Farida Yusuf didn't just play music, she redefined how we see others. He wrote, his words destined for tomorrow's column. "This is the art of dignity." He closed his notebook, his gaze lingering on the staff now moving freely through the hall, their names spoken aloud. A reporter nearby jotted down his quote, sensing a story that would resonate far beyond the gala. Harper's words were a testament, not just to Farida's talent, but to the shift she'd sparked, a reminder that music could rewrite more than melodies. It could rewrite systems. Victoria stood at a table, signing a printed timeline handed to her by the PR team. The document outlined clear steps: Farida Yusuf Scholarship Fund, applications opening next week, Keys for Dignity concerts starting Saturday in Harlem, and the stay out of the frame policy ending tomorrow. She initialed the corner, her signature a self-imposed contract, not legally binding, but morally so. Her phone buzzed with a shareholder's text. "This risks short-term losses." Victoria replied, "Long-term risk reduction comes from doing right." The response was a gamble, but one she now believed in, her usual calculus of profit giving way to a new measure of accountability. She handed the timeline to a staffer who pinned it to a board near the entrance. Its bullet points a roadmap for change. Farida approached the Steinway one last time, her fingers brushing the keys before she lowered the lid with a soft click. She turned to Victoria, her voice steady. "If you keep your word, remind me. If you slip, I'll remind you." The words were a pact, not a threat, a shared commitment to the work ahead. Victoria met her gaze, her usual armor softened. "Miss Gloria taught me how to start," she said. The name a deliberate choice, a nod to the housekeeper who'd spoken truth earlier. Farida nodded, her expression calm but resolute, as if sealing the moment with her presence. The night shift workers moved through the hall, their voices rising as they called each other's names. James, Maria, Thomas, a quiet chorus that filled the space. A maintenance worker paused, removing a faded "Stay Out of the Frame" sign from a corner of the hall. The screws came loose, leaving bare holes in the wall, a visible scar of the past but also a promise of a different future. The act was small but symbolic, a dismantling of a rule that had kept workers like Farida in the shadows. A server, her name tag reading Clara, watched, her eyes bright with something like hope. As the gala's guests dispersed, Farida stepped out of the Whitmore Grand, the New York night enveloping her. The streetlights cast long shadows, their glow a quiet echo of the chandeliers inside. She stood still, her breath visible in the cool air, her navy uniform no longer a mark of invisibility, but a testament to courage. Dignity wears no uniform, she thought, her mind echoing the night's lesson. It takes courage, and a promise is only as good as the actions that keep it. The city hummed around her, alive with possibility, as she walked forward, carrying the belief that one night's music could ripple into a legacy of change. As the curtains close on Farida Yusuf's transformative night at the Whitmore Grand, we're left with a powerful reminder. Dignity is forged through courage, and promises gain meaning through action. Farida's music didn't just fill a hall, it challenged a system, amplifying voices long unheard. What did this story stir in you? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment where someone's truth reshaped a room? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your reflections and where you're joining us from. Your voice matters in keeping these stories alive. Thank you for listening. for engaging with this journey of accountability and change. Subscribe to our channel to catch our next story, and join us again as we explore more tales that inspire, challenge, and redefine what's possible. Until next time, keep calling people by their names, and let's build a world where everyone is seen.